Welcome back to our channel. Today, we drift into one of the most profound and heartbreaking stories in American history, the rise, struggles, and ultimate displacement of the Cherokee Nation. From their sophisticated civilization to the forced Trail of Tears, we'll explore why the Cherokee really lost their land and the resilience that allowed their culture to survive. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dive history videos. Let's journey together into the untold stories of the past. Before the United States existed, before its laws, its borders, and its flags, the Cherokee were already living as a nation. This is important to understand because history often begins native stories at the moment Europeans arrive, as if nothing existed before that moment. But for the Cherokee, life did not begin with contact. It was already ancient, structured, and deeply rooted in the land long before any outsiders set foot on it. The Cherokee homeland stretched across vast regions of what are now called Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. These were not empty forests waiting to be claimed. They were living landscapes shaped by generations of human care. Fields were planted and harvested. Towns were built and rebuilt. Sacred sites marked places of ceremony, memory, and meaning. The Cherokee did not see land as an object to be owned or sold. They believed the land was alive and that people belonged to it, not the other way around. Rivers, mountains, animals, and forests were not resources. They were relatives. Every hill had a story. Every river carried memory. To be Cherokee was not simply to live on the land, but to exist in relationship with it. Cherokee society was organized, balanced, and sophisticated. They lived in towns connected by trade routes and alliances. These towns were not random settlements. They were centers of political life, spiritual practice, and community decision-making. Each town had a council house, often built at the center, where leaders gathered to discuss laws, resolve conflicts, and guide the future of the people. Leadership among the Cherokee was not based on absolute power. Chiefs were respected, but they did not rule as kings. Decisions were made through councils, discussion, and consensus. Wisdom, experience, and the ability to persuade mattered more than force. Authority came from trust, not fear. Cherokee society was also deeply spiritual. Their world was shaped by balance between humans and nature, between men and women, between the physical world and the spiritual one. They believed that every action affected the harmony of the world. When balance was broken, sickness, conflict, or disaster followed. This belief influenced everything, from how they farmed to how they resolved disputes. Agriculture was central to Cherokee life. Corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, were grown together in ways that enriched the soil and sustained the people. Farming was not exploitation, it was cooperation with the earth. Women played a powerful role in Cherokee society. They were the primary farmers, land stewards, and decision-makers in matters of home and property. Lineage was matrilineal, meaning family identity and inheritance passed through the mother's line. This gave women authority and respect that shocked later European observers. Children were raised not just by parents, but by the entire community. Elders were honored as living libraries of knowledge, stories, and tradition. History was passed down orally through storytelling, songs, and ceremonies. These stories were not myths in the modern sense. They were lessons about identity, responsibility, and survival. Time itself was understood differently. Cherokee history was cyclical, not linear. The past was always present, carried forward through ritual and memory. The future was not something to conquer, but something to prepare for by living rightly in the present. War existed, but it was not glorified. Conflict with neighboring tribes happened, but it followed rules and rituals. War leaders were separate from peace leaders, and violence was not a permanent state of life. After conflict, efforts were made to restore balance rather than seek endless revenge. This world existed for centuries before European contact. It was stable, adaptive, and resilient. It changed over time, but it did so according to its own values and needs. Then, slowly, that world began to feel pressure from the outside. The first rumors came long before the first settlers: strange ships, strange weapons, strange diseases. Stories traveled faster than people, and some elders sensed that something dangerous was approaching. Not because outsiders were evil, but because they did not understand balance. When Europeans finally arrived, they did not see a nation. They saw land. They looked at forests and saw timber. They looked at rivers and saw trade routes. They looked at fertile soil and saw profit, and they looked at Cherokee towns and did not recognize them as civilization because they did not resemble their own. To European eyes, civilization meant fences, private property, and written laws enforced by punishment. The Cherokee way of life did not fit that image, so it was dismissed as primitive not because it was simple, but because it was different. This misunderstanding would become deadly. At first, interactions were cautious. Trade began. Metal tools, weapons, and cloth were exchanged for animal pelts and food. The Cherokee were skilled negotiators and traders. They adapted quickly, incorporating new tools into their existing way of life. But trade was not neutral. It created dependency, it shifted power, and it opened doors to forces the Cherokee could not see. Disease arrived silently, carried by people who did not even know they were spreading it. Smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through communities with no natural immunity. Entire villages were wiped out in months. Elders died, taking generations of knowledge with them. Children were left orphaned. Ceremonies were interrupted. Balance was shattered. This devastation happened before most major conflicts even began, and yet the Cherokee survived. They mourned, adapted, and rebuilt. They absorbed new realities while trying to protect old values. They believed that cooperation might prevent destruction, that diplomacy could replace violence, that mutual respect was possible. For a time, it seemed like this might be true. But beneath every agreement, every handshake, every treaty, there was an unspoken truth. The land was desired, and desire does not stop at cooperation. As more settlers arrived, pressure increased. Hunting grounds shrank, forests were cut, rivers were diverted. The Cherokee found themselves surrounded by a society that measured success by expansion and wealth, not balance. Still, at this early stage, the Cherokee were not defeated. They were not powerless. They were not disappearing. They were a nation standing at the edge of a storm they could not yet fully see. A storm that would not come all at once, but slowly, law by law, promise by promise, until the ground beneath them would no longer be theirs. This is where their story truly begins, not with loss, but with existence. With a people who were already whole, already civilized, already alive long before anyone decided they should be removed. And to understand how the Cherokee lost their land, one must first understand this truth. They did not start as victims. They started as a nation, and nations are not erased overnight. The arrival of Europeans on Cherokee lands was not accompanied by cannon fire or the immediate clash of armies. It was quieter, subtler, and in many ways far more devastating. For the Cherokee, the first interactions with the newcomers came not as an invasion, but as trade. Strange men with strange tools appeared along rivers and forest paths, offering trinkets, metal knives, axes, cloth, beads, and firearms. They came not to conquer, at least not at first, but to profit. They came as traders, as explorers, as emissaries of distant kingdoms and colonies. bearing gifts that glimmered in sunlight and promised usefulness, power, and convenience. The Cherokee, for their part, were cautious but curious. They were a people with long experience in diplomacy, negotiation, and cautious openness. Their towns were well organized and their councils astute. The leaders recognized the potential benefit of trading with these strangers, while elders warned of the dangers they might bring. The Cherokee had already survived centuries of shifting alliances, conflicts, and migrations, and they approached this new encounter with both caution and hope. Trade began slowly, with mutual curiosity shaping the first interactions. Metal tools replaced stone axes, firearms offered power previously unimaginable, cloth replaced hand-woven garments, yet every exchange carried a price that was not immediately apparent. The Cherokee were entering a world that valued accumulation above balance, speed above wisdom, profit above harmony, and with trade came disease silent, invisible, merciless. Unlike battles or raids, which the Cherokee had known and could defend against, diseases were an enemy that struck without warning. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these pathogens traveled faster than any European army, moving along trade routes, carried by the very men who offered gifts. Villages that had stood for generations were decimated in months. Elders, the keepers of history, knowledge, and spiritual practice, were among the first to die. Without them, entire traditions were jeopardized. Children were left orphaned, communities fractured, and the very social fabric that had allowed the Cherokee to flourish began to fray. The arrival of disease transformed Cherokee society. It was not simply the loss of life. It was the erosion of trust, memory, and stability. Families mourned deeply, and whole communities had to rebuild from the ashes. The Cherokee responded in ways they had always known, through resilience, adaptation, and communal care. They did not abandon their traditions but sought to protect them, even as death and uncertainty became daily companions. Yet the most insidious threat was not disease alone. Trade, seemingly harmless or even beneficial, began to reshape Cherokee life. The new tools and firearms changed the nature of hunting and warfare. Metal knives, axes, and rifles offered efficiency but also increased dependency on European goods. The Cherokee, while masters of adaptation, found themselves tied into systems of exchange controlled by outsiders. Their survival, in subtle ways, began to rely on forces they did not fully control. European settlers, meanwhile, were expanding relentlessly. They came in greater numbers with each passing year, seeking land, resources, and wealth. Unlike the Cherokee, their societies were structured to exploit and dominate, not to maintain balance. They viewed land as property, ownership as absolute, and expansion as a right. They did not see the Cherokee as a nation. They saw them as obstacles, and obstacles could be removed, ignored, or assimilated. Even as disease and trade eroded the Cherokee way of life, the people adapted. They learned European customs, sometimes adopting them strategically. They incorporated foreign tools and practices into their own culture. They negotiated treaties, believing that written agreements could protect them. They believed that diplomacy and negotiation could prevent conflict and preserve their lands. They trusted in promises made on paper, and that trust would later be betrayed. The early encounters also exposed the Cherokee to new forms of political and social complexity. They observed how Europeans organized settlements, how they created laws, courts, and councils. Some Cherokee leaders saw lessons they could adopt to strengthen their own society, while others worried that these foreign practices could disrupt the delicate balance of their traditions. This tension between adaptation and preservation would define much of Cherokee history in the coming decades. The Cherokees' initial openness and strategic adaptation were remarkable. They were a people who could survive through negotiation, innovation, and diplomacy, not just through force. And yet, the more they adapted, the more they became visible targets. Europeans did not value their culture, their governance, or their civilization. The more the Cherokee mirrored European practices adopting literacy, farming techniques, and social organization, the more they threatened European narratives of native inferiority. In the eyes of settlers, successful adaptation made them more dangerous, not less. As settlements expanded, pressures on Cherokee land increased. Forests were cleared, rivers were diverted, and hunting grounds were taken. The Cherokee had survived disease, they had survived initial contact, and they had survived the slow encroachment of trade systems. But survival alone could not protect them from the relentless drive for land and resources. The outsiders did not seek negotiation at this point, they sought acquisition. Despite this growing danger, the Cherokee did not retreat. They reinforced their towns, maintained their governance, and continued their cultural practices. They celebrated ceremonies, taught children the old stories, and honored the elders who had survived the epidemic waves. They remained a living, breathing civilization, conscious of their history, their identity, and their rights. The Cherokee also began to understand the limits of adaptation. They saw that European laws, treaties, and promises were often tools, not protections. A paper treaty could be broken as easily as a stick in the fire. Words meant nothing if they did not serve the interests of those with power. And yet, the Cherokee continued to engage in diplomacy, hoping to protect their people and lands through negotiation, reasoning, and appeal to justice. This was a period of intense learning, painful adjustment, and relentless observation. Cherokee leaders watched European settlers closely, noting patterns of behavior, political structures, and economic systems. They understood the threat that the newcomers posed, even if the full extent of that threat was not yet visible. They learned that survival would require not just adaptation, but vigilance, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to the preservation of their nation. During this period, the Cherokee also deepened their spiritual and cultural practices. Ceremonies were used to process grief, honor those lost to disease, and reinforce community bonds. Storytelling remained central to the transmission of knowledge, ensuring that even as the world changed around them, the core values, ethics, and history of the Cherokee would survive. The past became a guide for navigating a future filled with uncertainty. Trade continued, diseases continued to ripple through communities, and the number of European settlers grew exponentially. The Cherokee faced pressure on multiple fronts: physical, economic, social, and political. Each of these pressures required a response. Each required a careful balance between maintaining identity and negotiating survival in a rapidly changing landscape. Even as the Cherokee adapted, their world was being reshaped in ways that were irreversible. Forests were cut down to make room for European-style farms. Rivers that had nourished generations of Cherokee were dammed or redirected. Game, once plentiful, became scarce. The very land that had sustained them for centuries was now contested territory. Despite these challenges, the Cherokee maintained hope. They believed that by learning the ways of Europeans, by engaging in trade, diplomacy, and legal negotiation, they could protect their people and lands. This belief was both a strength and a vulnerability. It showed their resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking, but it also exposed them to exploitation by those who had no intention of honoring agreements. The Cherokee experience during this period was a delicate dance of survival, adaptation, and observation. They navigated foreign diseases, complex trade systems, growing settlements, and legal pressures with remarkable skill. Yet they also began to recognize the harsh reality that their very success in adapting might make them more of a target, not less. Their civilization, intelligence, and resilience challenged the assumptions of the settlers, creating tension that would later be used as justification for their removal. By the end of this period, the Cherokee were a people profoundly changed by contact. They had faced unimaginable loss, adapted to foreign tools and ideas, and navigated a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. Yet they had not been defeated. They remained a nation, conscious of their identity, aware of the threats they faced, and committed to survival. This period in Cherokee history is crucial to understanding what came next. It is a story of adaptation under pressure, of resilience in the face of invisible enemies, and of the early seeds of betrayal that would later culminate in forced removal. The Cherokee did not lose their land because they were weak or unprepared. They lost it because the forces arrayed against them were relentless, and because the very skills that had allowed them to survive adaptability, diplomacy, and civilization could not protect them from a society driven by greed, expansion, and a disregard for justice. In these years, the Cherokee learned lessons that would guide them through the dark decades ahead. They learned the limits of trust in outsiders. They learned the costs of disease and dependence. They learned that survival required not just resilience, but strategy, vigilance, and sometimes sacrifice. And through it all, they maintained their culture, their identity, and their connection to the land that had defined them for centuries. It is impossible to overstate the significance of this period. The arrival of Europeans and the diseases and trade networks they brought were not minor inconveniences. They were forces that reshaped Cherokee society in profound ways. Yet the Cherokee response was not passive. They observed, adapted, negotiated, and preserved. They became a people navigating a rapidly changing world, aware of danger, but determined to endure. By understanding this period, we see the Cherokee not as victims of circumstance, but as active participants in their own history. We see a civilization grappling with unprecedented challenges, making decisions, learning, and surviving in ways that would shape their nation for generations. It sets the stage for the next chapter, the imposition of laws, treaties, and policies that would ultimately lead to their forced removal, despite all the skill, wisdom, and resilience they had demonstrated. The story of trade and disease is in many ways the story of the first cracks in a society under pressure, but it is also the story of courage, intelligence, and adaptability. The Cherokee were not passive observers of history. They were living it, shaping it, and enduring it, even when the forces around them were vast, invisible, and deadly. And it is in this crucible of early contact, disease, and trade that we begin to understand the full scope of what the Cherokee endured and why their eventual struggle to maintain their land was a fight not against weakness, but against a relentless tide of external pressures that would challenge any nation in the world. By the late 18th century, the Cherokee found themselves at a crossroads, caught between survival and adaptation in a world increasingly dominated by European settlers. For centuries, their society had functioned according to its own rhythms, guided by principles of balance, communal responsibility, and respect for the natural world. But the arrival of Europeans and the relentless expansion of the colonies presented challenges that could no longer be addressed through tradition alone. The Cherokee were forced to engage with a foreign legal, economic, and social system that measured value in ways alien to their worldview. It was in this era that the concept of civilization would emerge as both a tool and a weapon, a means by which outsiders justified intervention, and a test of survival for the Cherokee themselves. The Europeans, and later the Americans, approached the Cherokee with a simple yet insidious idea. If native people could adopt European ways, farming techniques, religion, literacy, and political structures, they would be allowed to maintain some measure of control over their land. This proposal was both seductive and dangerous. On the surface, it seemed to offer protection, recognition, and legitimacy. On a deeper level, it was a trap, a strategy designed to co-opt native societies into a framework that ultimately served colonial interests. The Cherokee, ever pragmatic and observant, began to navigate this landscape with intelligence and foresight. They did not reject European innovations outright, nor did they abandon their traditions. Instead, they sought a careful integration, a selective adaptation that would preserve their cultural identity while demonstrating to outsiders that they could meet the criteria of civilized society. It was a strategy of survival, rooted in the understanding that their land, their communities, and their sovereignty depended not only on physical endurance, but also on social and political recognition. Christianity was one of the first foreign systems that the Cherokee encountered in a meaningful way. Missionaries arrived, bringing not only religious teachings, but also literacy and schools. Some Cherokee saw Christianity as an opportunity to strengthen alliances, gain access to European education, and equip their children with skills necessary for a changing world. Others approached it cautiously, concerned about the spiritual implications and the potential erosion of traditional beliefs. In practice, many Cherokee adopted Christianity selectively, blending it with their own spiritual traditions rather than abandoning them entirely. Churches were built alongside traditional council houses. Christian teachings were studied alongside stories of ancestors, ceremonies, and rituals that had guided the Cherokee for generations. This careful synthesis allowed the Cherokee to demonstrate adaptability without entirely surrendering their cultural core. Education, in particular, became a powerful tool for the Cherokee. Sequoyah, a Cherokee scholar, created a written syllabary for the Cherokee language in the early 1820s, a monumental achievement that allowed the Cherokee to produce newspapers, legal documents, and literature in their own tongue. This innovation was both practical and symbolic. It allowed the Cherokee to engage with the broader political and economic world on their own terms, while simultaneously affirming the legitimacy and sophistication of their civilization. Literacy and written communication became markers of status, power, and adaptability, demonstrating to outsiders that the Cherokee were capable of self-governance, lawmaking, and social organization. In addition to spiritual and educational adaptation, the Cherokee embraced European-style agriculture and town planning. They built permanent homes, cultivated cash crops, and developed farms designed to produce both sustenance and marketable goods. Villages were reorganized to reflect more structured layouts, reflecting a blend of traditional spatial practices and European influence. Council houses continued to serve as centers of governance, but now they were complemented by courts, schools, and meeting halls that echoed the structures of American towns. Roads were built, bridges were constructed, and trade networks expanded. The Cherokee were becoming a society that outsiders could recognize as orderly, productive, and civilized by the standards of the day. This process of adaptation extended to governance as well. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a formal written constitution modeled in part on the United States Constitution. It established a system of executive, legislative, and judicial branches, a code of laws, and mechanisms for citizen participation. This was not imitation for its own sake. It was a deliberate, strategic act designed to demonstrate to the United States government and to settlers that the Cherokee could govern themselves in a manner consistent with Western notions of order, justice, and political sophistication. The Constitution codified laws on property, crime, and civil disputes, reinforcing the Cherokee commitment to social stability and self-determination. Cherokee women, too, played a vital role in this era of adaptation. Though European norms often sought to marginalize women, the Cherokee maintained matrilineal structures. Women continued to own land, manage agricultural production, and participate in decision-making at the community level. Their influence ensured that adaptation did not erase traditional authority, that change did not become subjugation. By balancing tradition and innovation, Cherokee women helped maintain continuity in the face of unprecedented external pressures. Despite these remarkable achievements, the very success of the Cherokee in adapting would become a source of vulnerability. European Americans, conditioned by racist assumptions and the logic of expansion, perceived native success not as proof of intelligence or civilization, but as a challenge to their ideology. The narrative of native inferiority had long justified conquest, displacement, and cultural suppression. The Cherokee, by demonstrating competence, sophistication, and self-governance, disrupted this narrative. They became, paradoxically, more visible targets precisely because they were thriving. Their farms, schools, newspapers, and legal systems were symbols not of assimilation, but of sovereignty, and sovereignty threatened those who desired the land they occupied. This tension became particularly acute with the discovery of valuable resources on Cherokee land. As settlers moved into the southeast, the lure of fertile farmland, timber, and minerals intensified the pressure to remove native populations. The Cherokee, despite their civilized status, were not immune. Adaptation could not shield them from the relentless logic of colonial expansion. Their achievements, rather than securing their rights, were often twisted into evidence that they were obstacles to progress, or that removal was justified for their own good. Even within Cherokee society, this period of adaptation brought internal challenges. Not all members agreed on how to engage with Europeans. Some elders resisted change, fearing that too much adaptation would erode cultural integrity. Others argued that selective adoption of European practices was essential for survival. These debates reflected the complex reality of being a people caught between worlds, the familiar, ancestral traditions of the past and the invasive, demanding structures of an expanding colonial society. Decisions were rarely simple. Leaders had to weigh short-term survival against long-term preservation, cultural integrity against political pragmatism. Trade continued to play a pivotal role in this era. The Cherokee engaged in commercial agriculture, producing crops for sale to European markets. Livestock, especially horses and cattle, became important assets. European-style markets and trade networks were integrated into the Cherokee economy, allowing for increased wealth and influence. Yet these systems also created dependencies. Reliance on European goods, credit systems, and fluctuating markets meant that the Cherokee were increasingly entangled in external economic forces beyond their control. Economic adaptation became another delicate balancing act, requiring foresight, negotiation, and constant vigilance. Religious adaptation, legal innovation, agricultural reform, and economic engagement together constituted a remarkable period of strategic transformation. The Cherokee were not passive recipients of European influence. They were active architects of a hybrid society that sought to harmonize tradition and change. Their success was extraordinary by any measure. They created a society that could have been admired as a model of resilience, creativity, and pragmatism. Yet, despite these remarkable achievements, the Cherokee faced a sobering reality. Adaptation and civilization, no matter how thorough, did not guarantee protection. European Americans, motivated by greed, expansion, and racial prejudice, increasingly viewed native lands as empty fields waiting to be claimed. The logic of removal began to take hold in policy debates. legal frameworks, and public opinion. The Cherokee, despite demonstrating their ability to govern, educate, and sustain themselves, were seen as impediments to the ambitions of settlers and government officials. It was in this context that treaties, promises, and legal protections began to erode. Agreements that should have secured Cherokee sovereignty were ignored, violated, or deliberately manipulated. The Cherokee had demonstrated competence, civility, and adaptability, but these qualities became reasons for dispossession rather than protection. Adaptation, which had been a survival strategy, paradoxically increased the pressure to remove them. The Cherokee's civilization challenged the very assumptions that justified colonization, making their existence politically inconvenient. The story of the Cherokee during this period is not only a story of adaptation, but also a story of resilience under pressure. It is a narrative of strategic engagement with external systems, careful blending of cultures, and deliberate assertion of sovereignty. It is also a story that reveals the cruelty of colonial logic. Success, intelligence, and civilization were not shields against displacement. They were reasons to intensify it. In their pursuit of adaptation, the Cherokee demonstrated remarkable foresight. They built institutions, codified laws, and educated their children, all in an effort to safeguard their nation. They cultivated their land, engaged in commerce, and participated in political negotiation, showing the world and themselves that they could thrive in a rapidly changing environment. Every decision reflected a careful weighing of risk and opportunity, a balancing of tradition with necessity, and a profound commitment to the survival of the Cherokee people. This era set the stage for the ultimate crisis that would define Cherokee history. Their civilization, far from protecting them, became part of the narrative used against them. The very success that might have secured recognition in a just society instead highlighted the incompatibility between Cherokee sovereignty and the ambitions of an expanding United States. Their adaptability could not shield them from greed, prejudice, or political expedience. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were therefore a time of both remarkable achievement and looming peril. The Cherokee demonstrated that they could adopt, innovate, and govern in ways that few outsiders could imagine. They preserved their culture while navigating unprecedented change. They adapted without losing themselves, a feat of extraordinary resilience. Yet, this period also revealed the limits of adaptation. No matter how sophisticated, how organized, how civilized, by European standards, the Cherokee remained vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The external pressures of land hunger, racial prejudice, and political maneuvering would soon escalate, leading to a confrontation that no degree of civilization could prevent. Their survival strategy, while brilliant, could not overcome the relentless expansion of a society built on conquest. The story of the Cherokee in this era is both inspiring and tragic. It shows a people at the height of strategic and cultural achievement, creating a hybrid civilization that honored their past while engaging with the future. It also foreshadows the betrayal, dispossession, and forced removal that would follow. Their adaptation, intelligence, and resilience would be tested in the harshest ways imaginable, but it also ensured that their identity, culture, and spirit would endure despite overwhelming adversity. Understanding this period is crucial. It reveals the extraordinary skill, wisdom, and determination of the Cherokee people, while also exposing the moral contradictions and systemic injustices of the society they were navigating. The Cherokee did not simply survive, they flourished in ways that demonstrated the full depth of their humanity, their civilization, and their capacity to endure. And yet, the pressures they faced were mounting, and the world around them was preparing for a confrontation that would test every lesson they had learned. In the end, this chapter of Cherokee history is a testament to the resilience of a people who, despite disease, trade pressures, and cultural intrusion, built a sophisticated society capable of governance, literacy, and economic achievement. It is a story of strategic adaptation, of negotiating with powerful outsiders, and of demonstrating capability in a world that refused to acknowledge it. And it is a prelude to the trials that would soon follow, when treaties, promises, and legal frameworks would collide with the relentless ambitions of an expanding nation, setting the stage for one of the most infamous episodes in American history, the forced removal of the Cherokee people from their ancestral lands. By the 1820s, the Cherokee had built a society that many would have considered a model of civilization in its time. They had adopted European-style agriculture, created schools, established courts, written a constitution, and embraced literacy through the syllabary developed by Sequoyah. Their towns were organized, their laws codified, and their citizens engaged in governance in ways that demonstrated remarkable sophistication. From every measurable standard, the Cherokee had adapted, survived, and thrived. Yet all of this achievement was about to collide with forces far beyond their control. In 1828, an event occurred that would dramatically alter the trajectory of Cherokee history. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land in the hills of northern Georgia. The discovery was not minor, nor was it fleeting. It sparked an immediate and overwhelming influx of settlers, miners, and opportunists. Suddenly, the land that the Cherokee had cultivated, governed, and cherished for generations became a beacon of greed for outsiders. What had been their home, their sacred landscape, and the foundation of their society was now seen primarily as a source of wealth waiting to be extracted. The discovery of gold created a profound moral and political dilemma for the United States. On one hand, the Cherokee had legal recognition as a sovereign nation. Treaties had been signed, courts had acknowledged their rights, and their constitution mirrored the structures of the very government they were now dealing with. On the other hand, the lure of gold created pressure from settlers, local politicians, and state governments to override these protections. The tension between law and desire would soon reach a boiling point, exposing the fragility of Cherokee sovereignty in a world dominated by expansionist ambitions. The state of Georgia, in particular, became a focal point of this conflict. Georgia politicians, influenced by land, hungry settlers, and the prospect of immense profit, passed laws asserting that Cherokee laws no longer applied within the state's borders. These laws were blatant violations of treaties and federal agreements, but they were enforced with relentless determination. Cherokee towns, courts, and governance structures were declared illegal. Their authority over their own land was systematically undermined. Suddenly, a nation that had successfully governed itself according to its own laws found itself treated as if it had no legal standing at all. The Cherokee were not without recourse. They turned to the courts, engaging in legal battles that demonstrated their understanding of both their own rights and the legal systems of the United States. In a remarkable act of courage and strategy, they took their case to the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a deliberate, calculated effort to assert their sovereignty, protect their lands, and ensure that the promises made in treaties were honored. The case, known as Worcester v. Georgia, would become a landmark in American legal history. In Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, affirming that the tribe was a distinct political community with sovereign rights over their own territory. The court explicitly stated that the state of Georgia had no authority to enforce its laws within Cherokee lands. This was a legal victory of monumental importance. On paper, it should have secured the Cherokees' right to govern themselves and remain on their ancestral lands. It was a triumph of justice, law, and the recognition of native sovereignty. Yet the reality on the ground was starkly different. President Andrew Jackson, whose administration was determined to remove native populations from the Southeast, refused to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. He reportedly stated, dismissively, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." In essence, the highest legal authority in the United States had spoken, affirming the rights of the Cherokee, but the executive branch chose to ignore it. The rule of law, so critical to the functioning of a democratic society, was subordinated to the desires of political power, greed, and expansion. This refusal to enforce legal protections exposed the fundamental vulnerability of the Cherokee, despite all of their efforts to adapt, educate, and govern themselves. They had built a society worthy of respect by any standard, yet those accomplishments were rendered meaningless by the ambitions of settlers and the failure of the U.S. government to uphold its own laws. Adaptation, intelligence, and civilization, which had been their tools of survival, could not protect them from the forces aligned against them. The discovery of gold also intensified pressure on Cherokee leaders from within and without. Settlers flooded onto their lands illegally, mining and claiming property with impunity. Violence, intimidation, and harassment became common. The Cherokee faced a dual challenge, defending their lands from immediate threats while navigating a political system that had already demonstrated its willingness to betray promises. Every negotiation, every appeal to fairness, was undermined by the reality that greed and power had taken precedence over law. At the same time, the Cherokee engaged in strategic diplomacy, attempting to negotiate with federal officials, state governments, and sympathetic allies. They sent delegations to Washington, D.C., hoping to secure enforcement of treaties and recognition of their sovereignty. These delegations were composed of individuals who understood the intricacies of U.S. law, politics, and society. They argued eloquently, citing treaties, constitutional principles, and precedents that supported their claims. Yet each appeal was met with delays, obfuscation, and ultimately, inaction. The machinery of government, rather than protecting justice, became an instrument of dispossession. The tension surrounding Cherokee lands was not merely a legal or political issue, it was a moral and cultural crisis. The Cherokee had demonstrated that native peoples could govern themselves, create legal systems, educate their children, and maintain stable societies. They had proven that the stereotypes of inferiority used to justify displacement were false. Yet, in the eyes of those who coveted the land, their very success was a threat. Civilization was not a shield, it was an indictment. The Cherokees' achievements contradicted the narrative used to rationalize removal, making them inconvenient witnesses to the possibilities of native governance. The gold rush in Georgia also had social and economic consequences that rippled through Cherokee communities. Families who had farmed for generations saw their fields overrun by miners. Towns that had been carefully organized according to Cherokee principles were disrupted by settlers seeking fortune. Social cohesion was tested as external pressures intensified. Leaders had to make difficult choices, whether to resist, negotiate, or prepare for eventual displacement. Every decision carried the weight of potential loss, and every action was scrutinized both internally and externally. It is important to recognize that the Cherokee were not passive in the face of these challenges. They resisted through every available means: legal action, diplomacy, and internal organization. They sought to maintain order within their communities, to educate their youth, and to preserve cultural practices that had survived centuries of external pressure. Their response was deliberate and strategic, grounded in the understanding that survival required more than strength. It required wisdom, foresight, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Despite these efforts, the forces arrayed against the Cherokee were formidable and relentless. Georgia, backed by settlers and political influence, continued to assert authority over Cherokee lands. Federal officials, including President Jackson, prioritized expansion and economic gain over legal and moral obligations. The Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia, though historic, was unenforceable in practice. The Cherokee were caught in a cruel paradox. They had demonstrated every quality that might have earned respect, yet those same qualities made them targets for removal. The period following the discovery of gold also exposed divisions and pressures within Cherokee society. Some leaders advocated for negotiation and accommodation, seeking to secure the best possible terms under increasingly hostile conditions. Others argued for resistance, emphasizing sovereignty and the protection of ancestral lands. These debates reflected the complex reality of a people navigating an existential crisis. Every path carried risk, and every decision had consequences that could affect generations. As the pressure mounted, the Cherokees' understanding of the external world deepened. They realized that treaties, legal victories, and appeals to justice could be ignored when power, greed, and ambition dictated otherwise. They understood that adaptation alone, no matter how thorough, could not guarantee protection. They were confronted with a painful truth. Survival required not only skill, intelligence, and governance, but also the capacity to confront forces willing to override law and morality entirely. The gold discovery and the subsequent legal battles also illustrate the broader pattern of native displacement in the United States. The Cherokee experience was not an isolated incident but part of a systemic strategy in which economic interest, expansionist ambition, and racial prejudice combined to justify the removal of native peoples from valuable lands. The mechanisms were complex: legal subterfuge, political pressure, selective enforcement, and the manipulation of treaties. Yet the result was consistent. The sovereignty of native nations was subordinated to the ambitions of a growing nation. In this context, Worcester v. Georgia stands out not only as a legal triumph, but also as a bitter reminder of the limits of justice. The Supreme Court's decision affirmed the Cherokee as a sovereign nation, recognizing their right to self-governance and control over their lands. It was a victory that should have guaranteed their safety and autonomy, yet, without enforcement, the ruling was effectively meaningless. It revealed the fragile nature of legal protections when confronted with political will and economic desire. The Cherokee had followed every rule, adopted every measure, and proven their capacity for self-governance, and yet the law could not protect them. The betrayal was compounded by the Indian Removal Act, signed 2 years later in 1830, which legally codified the goal of relocating native nations west of the Mississippi River. The discovery of gold had intensified the push for this policy, turning a struggle over resources into a federally sanctioned effort to remove the Cherokee entirely. The act was supported by settlers, politicians, and economic interests, and it set the stage for the forced removal that would become known as the Trail of Tears. Despite the overwhelming pressures, the Cherokee continued to resist in every way possible. They documented treaties, maintained their governance structures, and sought allies wherever they could find them. Leaders traveled to Washington, D.C., engaging with officials, lobbying for enforcement of the law, and appealing to the moral conscience of the nation. Their efforts were persistent, strategic, and courageous, yet they faced a system that had decided at every level that their land was more valuable than their lives or sovereignty. The events following the discovery of gold illustrate a cruel paradox in the history of the Cherokee. Their civilization, adaptability, and intelligence, qualities that should have ensured recognition and protection, became the very reasons their land was coveted. They demonstrated self-governance, legal sophistication, and economic productivity. And yet these achievements were ignored when they conflicted with the desires of settlers and the priorities of government. The Cherokee were punished not for failure but for success, not for weakness but for proving that they could thrive independently. Understanding this period is crucial to comprehending the subsequent removal of the Cherokee. The gold discovery and the legal battles surrounding it were not merely isolated events. They were part of a broader pattern of dispossession and betrayal. They reveal the mechanisms by which native sovereignty was systematically undermined, the ways in which law could be subverted, and the human costs of greed and ambition. They also highlight the extraordinary resilience, strategy, and courage of the Cherokee people, who navigated these challenges with intelligence, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to their nation. In the final analysis, the discovery of gold in Cherokee lands and the subsequent legal and political battles represent a pivotal moment in American history. It demonstrates how law, morality, and justice can be manipulated or ignored when they conflict with power and profit. It also underscores the profound injustice inflicted upon the Cherokee, who had proven themselves capable, civilized, and sovereign. And it sets the stage for one of the most tragic chapters in Native American history, the forced removal and the Trail of Tears, in which thousands of Cherokee would suffer and die for land that was rightfully theirs. Through all of this, the Cherokee remained a people defined not by the betrayals they faced, but by the strength with which they faced them. They fought with knowledge, strategy, and moral clarity, even as the forces arrayed against them became overwhelming. Their story during this period is a testament to resilience, courage, and the tragic consequences of a society in which justice is subordinate to ambition. By the early 1830s, the Cherokee people had already endured decades of pressure, betrayal, and encroachment. They had demonstrated remarkable adaptability, building schools, courts, constitutions, and towns. They had embraced literacy, agriculture, and diplomacy in ways that should have earned them recognition as a sovereign and capable nation. And yet, despite all these efforts, the United States government and the state of Georgia were preparing to strip them of everything they had worked so hard to protect. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. On paper, it was a policy that authorized the federal government to negotiate with native nations in the Southeast for their voluntary relocation to lands west of the Mississippi River. In reality, it became a tool for forced dispossession, designed to clear the lands of native peoples to make way for white settlers, agricultural expansion, and resource extraction. The act reflected the priorities of a nation driven by expansion, economic ambition, and racial prejudice. For the Cherokee, it represented an existential threat, a legal mechanism that could override every treaty, every Supreme Court ruling, and every demonstration of their civilization. The Cherokee, fully aware of the implications, did not surrender immediately. They resisted through legal and political channels, believing that their rights as a sovereign nation could still be defended. They appealed to Congress, lobbied the president, and sought allies in both the public and private spheres. Delegations traveled to Washington, D.C., carrying treaties, constitutions, and documentation of their governance. They spoke eloquently about their history, their sovereignty, and their contributions to civilization. Their arguments were grounded in law, morality, and reason. They sought not rebellion, but recognition of the rights that had been repeatedly promised and repeatedly violated. Despite their efforts, the forces aligned against them were overwhelming. Georgia had already nullified Cherokee laws within its borders, treating the Cherokee Nation as if it had no legal standing. Settlers were encroaching on farms and towns, often with violence and intimidation. The lure of fertile land, timber, and gold made compromise politically impossible for local and state authorities. The federal government, under Jackson, was unwilling to enforce treaties or court decisions that stood in the way of removal. The Cherokee were caught between law and power, principle and force, justice and ambition. Within the Cherokee Nation, debates raged over how to respond. Some leaders advocated for negotiation, believing that carefully crafted agreements could secure the best possible terms for relocation and survival. Others argued for resistance, emphasizing the sanctity of their ancestral lands and the impossibility of surrendering them without a fight. These debates reflected the profound complexity of the situation. Every decision carried life and death consequences, and every path offered both moral and practical risks. Families, towns, and generations depended on the wisdom of leaders who were navigating uncharted waters. Amidst these tensions, a treaty was forged in 1835, the Treaty of New Akota. This treaty ceded Cherokee lands in the southeast to the United States in exchange for territory west of the Mississippi and promises of protection and support during the relocation. The treaty was controversial from the start. It was signed not by the principal leaders of the Cherokee Nation, but by a small faction known as the Treaty Party, who did not have the authority to speak for the nation as a whole. The majority of Cherokee leaders, including Principal Chief John Ross, vehemently opposed the treaty, viewing it as illegitimate and a betrayal of the people. Nevertheless, the United States government used the treaty as legal justification for removal, treating the signatures of a few as the consent of the many. The passage of the treaty marked the beginning of the forced removal process. By 1838, U.S. troops had begun to enforce the policy with increasing rigor. Families were rounded up from their homes, often with little warning. Farms were seized, livestock taken, and homes burned to prevent return. The Cherokee were compelled to gather their possessions and prepare for a journey into the unknown, a journey that would become one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. The removal process was brutal and dehumanizing. Cherokee men, women, and children were forced into makeshift camps, where conditions were harsh, unsanitary, and overcrowded. Disease spread rapidly, food was scarce, medical care was minimal, and exposure to the elements was constant. Families were separated, and the elderly, infirm, and children were particularly vulnerable. Every step of the process was designed to expedite removal, with little regard for human dignity, safety, or life. The journey itself was a nightmare of exhaustion, hunger, and suffering. The Cherokee were forced to march hundreds of miles across difficult terrain, from the mountains and valleys of their ancestral lands to designated territories in what is now Oklahoma. The terrain was unforgiving, rivers swollen with rain, forests dense and dark, mountains steep and treacherous. The weather was equally cruel. Summer heat scorched unprotected travelers, and winter cold froze those without shelter. The Cherokee were forced to endure these conditions with minimal supplies, often relying on the meager rations provided by soldiers or government agents. Death was a constant companion on the Trail of Tears. More than 4,000 Cherokee would die along the journey, though estimates vary. They succumbed to disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure. Families buried their dead along the roadside, leaving the bodies of infants and elders in shallow graves as they continued the march. Parents watched helplessly as children fell to illness or fatigue. Entire communities were devastated, with survivors arriving at their new homes traumatized, weakened, and grieving. The psychological toll was immense. The Cherokee were not merely displaced, they were stripped of their identity, their autonomy, and the landscapes that had defined their culture for generations. Sacred sites, burial grounds, and ancestral towns were abandoned, leaving the survivors with a profound sense of loss. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, the Cherokee persevered. They continued to maintain cultural practices, tell stories, and care for one another, demonstrating resilience that defied the cruelty imposed upon them. The Trail of Tears was not an isolated incident of hardship. It was part of a broader system of systematic dispossession that affected multiple native nations in the Southeast. The Cherokee, however, became a symbol of both the injustices of forced removal and the endurance of native identity. Their journey highlighted the failure of the United States government to honor treaties, enforce legal protections, or recognize the sovereignty of native peoples. It revealed the human cost of expansionist policies justified by greed, racial prejudice, and the lust for land. During this period, the Cherokee leadership faced impossible choices. Principal Chief John Ross worked tirelessly to negotiate, resist, and protect his people. He petitioned Congress, appealed to public opinion, and documented every violation of treaties and legal protections. Yet even the most eloquent advocacy could not overcome the power of federal and state authorities determined to remove the Cherokee. Ross and other leaders bore the weight of responsibility for thousands of lives, knowing that every decision could result in death, suffering, or loss. The social fabric of Cherokee society was tested as never before. Families who had lived in close, knit communities for generations were uprooted. Social hierarchies, governance structures, and cultural practices were disrupted. Elders who had been central to maintaining knowledge and tradition often died along the journey, taking irreplaceable wisdom with them. The Cherokee were forced to reconstruct their society in exile, carrying with them the trauma of displacement while striving to maintain continuity and identity. Despite the immense suffering, the Cherokee demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Communities formed along the route, offering mutual aid, sharing resources, and protecting vulnerable members. Stories, songs, and ceremonies were preserved and adapted to the journey. Even in the most dire circumstances, the Cherokee maintained their sense of collective identity, a testament to the strength of their cultural foundations. The Trail of Tears also exposed the stark contrast between law and enforcement. Treaties had been signed, legal victories won, and promises made, yet none of these protections prevented the forced removal. The Cherokee had followed every legal avenue, demonstrated civilization, and engaged in diplomacy, yet they were still subjected to removal, suffering, and death. This reality underscores a central truth. In a system driven by power and greed, even law, reason, and justice can be rendered meaningless. Economically, the removal devastated the Cherokee as well. Farms, crops, and livestock were abandoned or seized. Trading networks collapsed. Generational wealth, carefully built through agriculture, commerce, and governance, was lost. The Cherokee were forced to start over in unfamiliar territory, often under harsh conditions with inadequate resources. The financial and material losses compounded the emotional and cultural trauma, creating a multifaceted crisis that would affect generations. The Trail of Tears also highlighted the complicity of ordinary citizens in the displacement process. Settlers, miners, and local authorities often acted with hostility, taking advantage of the chaos to seize land, property, and resources. Violence, intimidation, and exploitation were common. The Cherokee were not merely facing institutional policies, they were confronting a society in which widespread prejudice and opportunism made survival even more difficult. Yet even amid this suffering, the Cherokee preserved their dignity, culture, and sense of self. Upon arrival in the designated Indian Territory, they began the arduous task of rebuilding. They re-established governance structures, created schools, and cultivated farms. They preserved language, traditions, and spiritual practices, ensuring that the trauma of removal did not erase their identity. The Cherokees' ability to endure, adapt, and rebuild is a testament to their resilience and strength. The legacy of the Trail of Tears is profound. It is a story of injustice, suffering, and betrayal, but also of courage, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of a people. The Cherokee were forcibly removed from lands they had inhabited for centuries, yet they carried with them the knowledge, culture, and identity that could not be stolen. The march left scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, that persisted for generations, but it also demonstrated the capacity of the Cherokee to survive against overwhelming odds. Understanding the Trail of Tears is essential to understanding the broader history of Native American displacement. It illustrates the human cost of expansionist policies, the failure of legal protections, and the consequences of greed and prejudice. It also provides insight into the resilience of Native communities, who, despite systematic attempts at erasure, preserved their identity, culture, and sovereignty. The Cherokee experience during the Trail of Tears is both tragic and instructive. It shows the consequences of a society in which law, morality, and justice are subordinated to ambition and profit. It also shows the extraordinary courage, strategy, and endurance of a people who faced near destruction and yet refused to surrender their identity. Even in the darkest moments, the Cherokee maintained their humanity, helping one another survive, preserving traditions, and asserting their sovereignty in exile. Their journey was a crucible of suffering, but it also became a testament to their resilience, intelligence, and commitment to survival. It is a story that demands recognition, reflection, and remembrance. The Trail of Tears was not simply a march. It was a profound moral failure of a nation, a deliberate disruption of a thriving civilization, and a human tragedy of staggering proportions. It is also a story of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable will of the Cherokee people to preserve their nation against all odds. Through loss, suffering, and displacement, they carried forward the legacy of a civilization that refused to vanish, ensuring that their history, culture, and identity would endure despite unimaginable adversity. The story of the Cherokee is often reduced to a single narrative of tragedy, a people who lost their land, endured forced removal, and suffered unimaginable suffering along the Trail of Tears. While this narrative captures the scale of their suffering, it obscures the deeper, more complex truth of why the Cherokee lost their land, a truth rooted not in weakness, ignorance, or failure, but in a collision between two fundamentally different visions of the world, a clash between sovereignty and greed, and a society driven by expansion and exploitation. Understanding this requires a careful examination of history, law, power, and human ambition, as well as the extraordinary resilience of the Cherokee people who endured despite the odds. At the heart of the Cherokee story is the principle of sovereignty. For centuries, the Cherokee Nation existed as a self-governing, structured society with complex political, legal, and social systems. Their governance was sophisticated, balancing the needs of individuals, families, and communities. Decisions were made collectively, councils deliberated with wisdom, and laws were designed to maintain harmony and order. This sovereignty was not theoretical. It was lived and practiced daily. Cherokee leaders had authority because their people respected them, not because they imposed it through force. Their laws reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about governance, conflict resolution, and communal responsibility. Yet sovereignty alone could not protect the Cherokee from the forces of expansion. European settlers and later American politicians viewed the land itself as a commodity to be owned, exploited, and expanded upon. This world you fundamentally clashed with that of the Cherokee, for whom land was not property but a living relationship, a sacred connection to ancestors and the natural world. When two such visions collide, it is often the one measured in terms of profit, extraction, and power that prevails, not because it is just, but because it is backed by force, law, and societal consensus that favors exploitation. The Cherokee adapted in extraordinary ways to try to bridge this gap. They embraced European-style agriculture, adopted literacy, wrote a constitution, built schools, and codified laws in ways that mirrored those of the United States. They engaged in diplomacy, negotiations, and legal battles to assert their sovereignty. They demonstrated repeatedly and clearly that they were capable of self-governance, economic productivity, and cultural sophistication. In short, they became, by any standard, a civilization worthy of recognition. Yet paradoxically, this very success contributed to the pressures that led to their loss. Settlers and politicians could not abide the existence of a thriving, civilized native nation in the heart of lands they coveted. The Cherokees' accomplishments disrupted the narrative used to justify displacement, the idea that native peoples were savage and incapable of self-governance. Civilization, in their case, became inconvenient. The Cherokee were not removed because they failed to adapt. They were removed because they succeeded, because their very existence on valuable land became politically and economically inconvenient for an expansionist society. Legal mechanisms, while offering the appearance of protection, proved insufficient against the ambitions of power. Treaties had been signed, Supreme Court decisions issued, and promises made, yet none of these could ultimately prevent removal. Worcester v. Georgia, a landmark case affirming Cherokee sovereignty, was ignored by President Andrew Jackson, exposing the limits of legal recourse when executive will and political pressure override the law. The Indian Removal Act provided a federal mandate for dispossession, giving legal cover to actions that were morally and ethically indefensible. In short, the Cherokee lost their land not because they lacked civilization or intelligence, but because the law itself could be manipulated to serve expansionist and economic goals. The discovery of gold in Georgia further intensified the pressures on the Cherokee. Suddenly, their lands were not just territories of cultural and agricultural significance. They were sites of immense wealth. Settlers poured in, often illegally, to stake claims and extract resources. Georgia politicians, A.C.